Veteran NBC commentator rips failures pro-war posture of corporate media in scathing resignation letter. So basically, this guy left MSNBC. Why? Because it's so pro-war. Let's hear what he has to say. In a biting resignation letter published in full by CNN on Wednesday, longtime NBC News reporter, commentator, and military analysis Bill Arkin blasted the corporate media network for embracing U.S. national security leaders and generals while ignoring the empirical truth of what they have wrought. There is not one country, well, I think that's a typo. It says county. I think they probably mean country. There is not one country in the Middle East that is safer today than it was 18 years ago. Indeed, the world becomes ever more polarized and dangerous. Reflecting on his past couple of decades working with the network, in addition to writing books and columns for major newspapers and serving as a military advisor to human rights and environmental groups, Arkin laments, "My expertise, though seeming to be all the more central to the challenges and dangers we face, also seems to be less valued at the moment. And I find myself completely out of sync with the network, being neither a day-to-day reporter nor interested in the Trump circus." Noting in his 2,228-word memo that the world and the state of journalism are in tandem crisis, Arkin delivers a scathing critique of how NBC has responded to the foreign policy of Donald Trump, whom he calls an ignorant and incompetent imposter, asserting that in many ways NBC just began emulating the national security state itself, busy and profitable. No wars won, but the ball is kept in play. However, Arkin also delivers a broader condemnation of the network's coverage of the so-called War on Terror in the nearly 18 years since 9/11, and how it has helped produce a scenario in which perpetual war has become accepted as a given in our lives. He writes, "Seeking refuge in its political horse race roots, NBC and others, meanwhile, report the story of war as one of Rumsfeld versus the generals, as Wolfowitz versus Shinsky, as the CIA versus Cheney, as the bad torturers versus the more refined, about the number of troops and number of deaths, and even then Obama versus the Congress. Poor Obama couldn't close Guantanamo to reduce nuclear weapons or stand up to Putin because it was just so difficult. We have contributed to turning the world national security into this sort of political story. I find it disheartening that we do not report the failures of the generals and national security leaders. I find it shocking that we essentially condone continued American bombing in the Middle East and now Africa through our I find it shocking that we essentially condone continued American bombing in the Middle East and now Africa through our ho-hum reporting." All right, so let's look at a little more of his letter. "For me, I realized how out of step I was when I looked at Trump's various bumbling intuitions, his desire to improve relations with Russia, to denuclearize North Korea, to get out of the Middle East, to question why we are fighting in Africa, even in his attacks on the intelligence community and the FBI. Of course, he is an ignorant and incompetent imposter, and yet I'm alarmed at how quick NBC is to mechanically argue the contrary, to be in favor of policies that just spell more conflict and more war. Really? We shouldn't get out of Syria? We shouldn't go for the bold move of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula? Even on Russia, though we should be concerned about the brittleness of our democracy that is so vulnerable to manipulation, do we really yearn for the Cold War? And don't even get me started with the FBI. What? We now lionize this historically destructive institution?" So an MSNBC employee was tired of how pro-war the network is, tired of how tribal they are, tired of their inability to let critical thinking guide their decision-making. Why? Because their owners wouldn't want that. My one question to this guy would be, did you not know who your employer was when you got hired? MSNBC is currently owned by Comcast. Before being owned by Comcast, they were owned by General Electric. General Electric made their money in bombs, among other things. As a result, MSNBC never saw a war they didn't like. They have championed every war in my lifetime. and probably this gentleman's as well. The people who got the Iraq war right, they fired. The people who got it wrong, they promoted. If you say anything out of step with their corporate narrative, which is funded by oil and gas companies, weapons makers, and Comcast, they will fire you. That is why you see segments where Rachel Maddow, a Rhodes Scholar, pretends like she doesn't understand net neutrality. She does, but if she gives an honest report on it, she will be fired because her employer, Comcast, hates net neutrality. They want net neutrality to go away because they can screw over consumers more if it does. And it amazes me that every day we wake up and there's just not a huge headline, hey, United States, your media is owned by a small handful of corporations that have no business. They have nothing to do with news and information. Comcast has nothing to do with news and information. Jeff Zucker has nothing to do with news and information. Rupert Murdoch and his empire has nothing to do with news and information. But they're big corporations. They have deep pockets. We let them control our media. It's amazing. Why do we passively accept this? What if it was a different corporation? What if it was McDonald's? Hey, we're getting into the news business. McDonald's getting into the news business. You know, whenever they report crime, you see the Hamburglar and they're like, hey, we're going to report some crime. Don't forget to buy our product. Here's our criminal. He likes burgers. Grimace gives you the weather. You're reading the news, you're like, oh, I see no problem with McDonald's getting in the news and information business. I'm sure this article about how a Big Mac, if you eat a Big Mac every day, it increases your penis size, is totally science. It also gives you instant abs. This is science. I'm sure there's nothing wrong with this study. Why is it any different? If McDonald's wanted to get into news, they were like, yeah, we're going to be a major cable news. We're going to own a cable news network now. I think people would sort of be like, oh, that's not appropriate. Why is Comcast any different? They're not. They're not. Why is the Murdoch empire any different? It's not. And whenever people in this country go, Ron, are you calling for, would you rather the media be run by the state? Yes! Yes, I would. Are you kidding me? Yes. The BBC is not perfect. The CBC is not perfect. I'm not going to try to say they are. But to have funds allocated for an overseen state-run entity for news and information, would that be better than what we have? Yes! Because at least there's some accountability. Would corruption still happen? Yes, of course it would. Would it be perfect? No. Would it be light years better than what we have? Yes! Are you kidding? Yes! We're better off just letting corporations do whatever the hell they want? That's news and information. That's not the media structure we've always had in this country, by the way. We used to arguably have the most regulated media structure in the history of democracy. It could be argued. Why? Because we had different newspapers that were all founded by schools of political thought. Socialists, constitutionalists, federalists, they all had their own newspapers. And how was the government involved? They distributed them. Because it was distributed via the post office, the government would subsidize it because it was news and information. So if you had a newspaper, you could get involved with the press, but you had to come at it from a school of thought. And sure, there was some yellow journalism out there, but there was also many different rounded perspectives. In an average metropolitan area, had about 10 different newspapers. Something like that, where you had a set-aside governmental agency that funded different newspapers from different schools of thought, would be infinitely better than what we have now. And here's a guy that wants to report honestly on War and Peace, and he realizes he can no longer do that with his employer. He was probably never able to. And I guess it's just seeing the current state of affairs that pushed him to his breaking point. Well, I guess we'll see what this guy does next. I don't know if he's going to go to another network, because I don't see it being any better anywhere else.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together